She thought it was just an old airframe, sun-faded aluminum, long abandoned, tucked away in the rafters of her grandfather's forgotten barn. But when Riley Monroe wiped the dust from the nose cone and cracked open the sealed cargo hold, she didn't find rusted tools or spare parts. She found something that made her knees buckle, a secret stashed decades ago behind rivets and silence, and worth over $6 million. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe some stories are more than just legends, if you're drawn to tales of legacy, grit, and the quiet kind of discovery that changes everything, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just top this one. The air was still the day Riley Monroe opened the barn. It had been 12 weeks since the funeral, 3 since she'd officially inherited the property, and almost 1 since she'd driven the long stretch of rural highway back to North Carolina with her father's battered toolbox riding shotgun. The house was a wreck, asbestos warnings taped to the front porch, the roof line sagging like a bad memory. But the barn? It sat hunched at the back of the field, weathered and sun-bleached, leaning slightly to the east like it had been eavesdropping on history. She hadn't planned to go inside that day. Not yet. But something about the light caught her eye, a soft glint between 2 planks, dull gold in the late morning haze. She slipped on gloves, shoved the rusted latch with a grunt, and let the heavy doors groan open. Dust swirled. The scent of old hay, oil, and cedar sap filled her lungs, and then she saw it, the curve of metal in the shadows. Not a tractor, not farming equipment, something much bigger. She stepped inside, boots crunching on gravel and scattered nails. The shape began to emerge in the filtered light. A fuselage, weathered but unmistakable. The nose of a plane. Huge. Older than her father. Maybe older than her grandfather. "What the hell?" she whispered. Her breath fogged the air. The barn was colder than it should have been. Maybe from the insulation, maybe from the weight of something she didn't understand yet. Riley moved closer, fingertips brushing the dull aluminum, watching the dust come away in streaks. Her grandfather had told stories, sure, about flying cargo after the war, about strange jobs with no clear explanation. But she'd always thought they were just that, stories. This wasn't a story. This was real. A twin-boom cargo aircraft, half covered in tarps, bales of hay stacked around it like camouflage. She circled it slowly, spotting a faded insignia near the rear tail, and what looked like the edge of a military stencil on the underside. Her pulse quickened. Why would he hide a plane? The thought hit her like a dropped wrench. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this bird buried, and someone else, maybe her, was about to find out why. She squatted near the front landing gear, noticed a toolkit rusted shut beside one wheel, and a crate labeled simply, "Handle with care." Something inside her stirred. Curiosity. Memory. A question she hadn't even known to ask until just now. She looked up at the barn's high windows, at the shafts of sunlight filtering through the slats and striking the aircraft's skin in golden patches. It felt like the beginning of something. Like her grandfather had left this here not to be forgotten but to be found. And for the first time in weeks, Riley Monroe didn't feel lost. She felt chosen. The next morning, Riley brought coffee, a tarp, and her socket set. She didn't sleep much the night before. Her mind kept replaying the moment the barn doors swung open, the way the dust lifted like theater curtains, and the sight of the plane impossibly intact, impossibly hidden. It wasn't just an old hunk of metal. It was deliberate, protected, preserved in a way that said, this mattered to someone. Now, with daylight filtering through the slats again, Riley peeled back the remaining covers. The plane's full shape revealed itself slowly, like a relic waking from sleep. Twin tails, fat belly, wide wingspan nearly grazing the barn walls on both sides. She walked its length, running her hand across faded military paint. There were remnants of green and gray camo beneath layers of grime, with flaked stenciling along the fuselage. U.S. Army Air Forces. A serial number, barely legible. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a Fairchild C-82 packet, a World War II cargo plane used for paratrooper drops, equipment transport, and post-war supply missions. She hadn't seen one in person since trade school, and certainly not one in a barn in rural Carolina. She crouched to examine the tires. Still inflated. Cracked, sure, but they held air like someone had rotated them, or checked them not long ago. That's what didn't add up. Her grandfather had passed at 94. Sharp as a tack until the very end, but slow, shaky, far from someone who could sneak into a barn and maintain a piece of military aviation history. So who had helped him? And why keep it a secret? She wiped sweat from her brow, stepped up onto the wing using an old wooden crate, and leaned against the fuselage. One of the side hatches was partially open. She worked it loose with a crowbar and peeked inside. The cockpit was stripped, but not gutted. Most of the gauges were still in place. Some wiring remained, tucked behind panels. A sheaf of papers lay curled in the co-pilot's seat, like it had been left there yesterday. She eased inside, the smell of oil and dust and old leather hitting her like a memory. She sat down gently in the pilot's chair, surprised at how natural it felt. Her hands hovered over the controls. They trembled. Not from fear, from reverence. Like she was sitting in a confession booth made of rivets and carbon steel. Her grandfather had flown this. She knew it in her bones. And that meant all the stories he'd told, the vague mentions of missions in South America, Europe, the Pacific, weren't barstool bluffs. They were real. He'd flown after the war ended. Secret flights. Silent cargo. Government contracts he never elaborated on. Riley leaned back in the chair and stared through the cracked windshield at the beams of sunlight ahead. 1,000 questions clawed at her, but only one rose to the top. What was this plane still carrying, and why had he kept it hidden all these years? She found the flight log 3 days later, in a metal drawer built into the wall behind the barn's tool bench. Riley had been searching through crates of mildewed manuals and old parts, spanners wrapped in burlap, a can of rivets from 1943, even a few faded aviation maps when the drawer stuck. She tugged, cursed, hit it with the palm of her hand. It jerked open an inch farther, and something slid inside. A leather-bound book, stained dark around the edges. She recognized it instantly. Her instructors at trade school had passed similar ones around when talking about the history of flight crews. Pilots kept logbooks like Bibles. Every departure, every landing, every minute in the sky was scribbled in those narrow lines like gospel. She opened it slowly. The name on the inside cover was written in strong, slanted cursive. Captain John H. Monroe, 1945. Her grandfather. She sat down right there on the cold barn floor, back pressed to a support beam. The logbook balanced on her knees. Her fingers moved through the pages like she was flipping through someone's life because she was. At first, it was routine. Flights from Charleston to Boston, short hauls between domestic airfields, all dated shortly after VJ Day. But the entries grew stranger as the months went on. The 3rd of January 1946 departure. Tempelhof, AAF, Berlin. Arrival. Location, redacted. Payload, 3 crates, marked fragile. Clearance level, White Fox. The 14th of March 1946 departure. Palermo, Sicily. Arrival, Mobile, Alabama. No manifest logged. No manifest? That was never done. Not for real cargo. She flipped forward to the final entries. Dated early 1947. Then, nothing. The last page was a single line. The 29th of April 1947 departure. Lodges Field, Azores. Arrival, home. But there were no more flights after that. Just a smudged thumbprint, as if he'd closed the book and never opened it again. Home. That must have been here, this farm, this barn, this forgotten field between tobacco rows and pine trees. She looked up, eyes drifting across the dust-drenched sunlight. That was the last flight. That C-82, the one parked right behind her, was the plane. And for some reason, After that final run, he didn't return it to base, didn't file it as missing. Just landed it in his own backyard, stored it behind barn doors, and never said a word. No records, no trail, just silence. What kind of man lands a military cargo plane in a hayfield and never speaks of it again? What did he bring back that made him disappear in plain sight? Riley closed the book gently, as if it might break. The questions inside her multiplied like sparks, threatening to catch fire. But one thing was clear now. Whatever that last mission was, it hadn't ended. Not really. Not yet. The cargo door didn't want to move. Riley spent the better part of an hour clearing hay bales, dismantling a makeshift scaffold that had once propped up the tail, and brushing decades of grime off the rear ramp seals. She found 2 heavy-duty latches, rusted shut and fused with time. WD-40 barely made a difference. She tried heat, then leverage. Finally, with a 2-foot crowbar and the patience of someone who needed answers more than breath, one latch gave with a deafening metallic crack. The second took longer. When it finally groaned free, the sound echoed through the barn like thunder. Her palms burned from the effort. Her heart raced. This was it. Riley backed up and eyed the cargo ramp. It was designed to open outward, downward like a jaw unlocking. She climbed into the cockpit one more time and located the manual release. The lever was stiff. She braced herself, pulled with both hands, and whoomp! The ramp jolted. Dust and straw spilled from the seams. Slowly, it lowered itself, just enough for a beam of sunlight to sneak into the darkness inside. Riley climbed down, her boots hitting the ground hard. She walked to the edge, heart pounding, the open mouth of the aircraft gaping before her. Inside was shadow, and then shape. She stepped in. The air was musty, colder than the rest of the barn, like it had been sealed for decades, untouched by time. Her flashlight cut across steel ribs, canvas webbing, and then boxes. Not 1 or 2, dozens, stacked along the interior walls, strapped in tight with netting that had yellowed with age, were sealed wooden crates. Some were stamped with military markings. Others had only numbers, or foreign script. All were secured with bent nails and old padlocks. But it wasn't just the quantity. It was the weight in her gut. Riley approached the nearest crate about 3 feet long, wide enough to hold a rifle or a sculpture. She ran her fingers along the wood, brushed away dust, and caught a glimpse of red wax seal on one corner. A symbol she didn't recognize. European, maybe. Carefully, she pried at the edge with a flathead. The wood splintered slightly as the lid loosened. The smell that hit her was old wood and varnish and something faintly floral. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and burlap, was a painting. She didn't know art, not really. But even she could see the detail in the brushstrokes, the age in the canvas. The signature in the bottom right was German. The subject, a woman in a red scarf, looking over her shoulder, something mournful in her eyes. Riley staggered back. 1 painting. She looked around. 2 dozen more crates. What was this? Not scrap, not supplies. This was curated, preserved, smuggled. And whatever it was doing in her grandfather's cargo hold, it had stayed hidden for 78 years. Until now. Riley didn't open another crate right away. She sat on the floor of the cargo bay, surrounded by silence and secrets, her head against the curved hull of the plane. The painting lay beside her, face up. The woman's gaze seeming to follow her solemn, beautiful, patient. It wasn't just art. It was memory. Someone had painted her. Someone had lost her. And now she was here, wrapped in burlap, waiting for air again. Riley didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Awe? Guilt? Fear? It felt like all 3. Eventually she opened 3 more crates. Each one held a piece of artwork all carefully packed, some in wooden frames, some loose on canvas stretchers. There were no signs of decay, no mildew, no bugs. Just immaculate preservation, as if the entire collection had been frozen in time. She counted 11 crates before she stopped, too overwhelmed to keep going. One of them contained something even more curious, a stack of handwritten letters, tied in string, tucked beside a smaller portrait wrapped in velvet. The letters were in German, with occasional French and Italian phrases. Names she didn't recognize, but a few words stood out. Verloren, beschützt, zurückgeben, lost, protected, return. That's when it hit her. This wasn't just cargo. It was art likely looted, displaced, stolen, smuggled across oceans and decades. And her grandfather had brought it here. Not for sale, not for profit, but for safekeeping. It made her dizzy. This wasn't just hidden history, it was the kind of thing people got arrested over, investigated for, locked up for. She went to the house and pulled out her laptop. The connection was slow, rural, but she managed to find an international art registry. 10 minutes of searching, and she nearly dropped the laptop. The first painting she'd opened, the woman in the red scarf, listed under missing since 1945. Taken from a gallery in Krakow during the German withdrawal. Estimated value, $800,000. Riley closed the laptop slowly. One painting. $800,000. She had 23 unopened crates. The math didn't just add up. It screamed. 6 million? Maybe more. Her mouth went dry. She stared through the kitchen window toward the barn, that looming silhouette at the edge of the trees. Her grandfather had been sitting on a treasure trove. Not buried, but tucked away in plain sight, wrapped in canvas and silence. What was she supposed to do with it? Who did it belong to? And most frightening of all, who might come looking for it? That night, Riley didn't sleep. She kept picturing him, her grandfather, out there in the cold of 1947, stepping off that plane for the last time, knowing what he'd brought home, choosing to keep it hidden. Not because it was valuable, but because it wasn't his to keep. And now, it was hers. The letter was folded 4 times and sealed in a zippered canvas pouch tucked inside an old mechanic's bag under the co-pilot's seat. Riley hadn't seen it until she was searching for something, anything that could explain why her grandfather had hidden priceless art in a barn for nearly 8 decades. The pouch was thick with oil stains, the zipper almost corroded shut. She thought it might be tools, maybe old flight papers, but what she found was something else. One envelope, cream-colored, fragile at the folds, addressed in ink that had faded to sepia. To be opened if I am gone. No name, no date. She read it at the kitchen table, alone, with the plane still visible through the dusty window glass and her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the paper out. Riley, if you're reading this, it means the world caught up to me. And I'm sorry I didn't explain this when I should have. After the war, I was part of a retrieval unit. Our job wasn't glamorous. We weren't chasing spies or planting flags. We were reclaiming stolen things. Art, mostly. From salt mines, from bunkers, from castles and bombed-out museums. Some pieces went back where they belonged. Some never could. In 47, I was ordered to transport a shipment that was unclaimed. I knew that word meant something different in every language. But when we got to a village outside Krakow, something happened. A woman, old, barefoot, grief carved into her face, handed me a portrait wrapped in linen and said, "He never made it home, but let her live somewhere safe." I couldn't leave it behind. I couldn't leave any of it behind. So I flew the shipment to a place no one would think to look. I flew it home. I didn't know what to do with it. I just knew it didn't belong in a vault, and it sure as hell didn't belong in a warehouse where no one knew the story. Maybe I was waiting for someone braver than me to figure it out. That's you. Love. Pop. She read it twice. Then a third time. Tears slipped silently down her face, not just from the truth in the ink, but from the guilt curling in her chest. He hadn't been hiding treasure. He'd been carrying a burden, a quiet, heavy kind that no one else had been willing to shoulder. Riley folded the letter slowly and set it back on the table, her knuckles pale from gripping the edge of the wood. The story had changed. This wasn't about stolen art anymore. This wasn't about money. It was about a promise. One her grandfather made in the ruins of a broken world, and now she was the only one left to keep it. She looked toward the barn, not to the plane, but to the weight it had carried for 78 years. And for the first time since opening that cargo door, she knew exactly what she had to do. She made 3 phone calls the next morning, one to a war museum curator in Charlotte, another to a former art theft investigator she found through a quiet forum of World War II historians, and the third, the hardest, to her childhood friend Jonah, who now worked as a criminal defense attorney in Raleigh. She didn't say much over the phone, just that she'd found something big, and that she needed to know what would happen if she told the truth. Jonah showed up that night, still in his wrinkled shirt and tie, driving a car that smelled like court coffee and worn leather. He didn't ask questions right away. He waited until she led him to the barn, turned on the floodlights, and slid open the cargo door. "Jesus," he whispered. She didn't speak, just watched him walk slowly past the crates, past the yellowed military straps and faded wax seals, his hand grazing the edge of a wooden box like it might shatter. Inside the house, she showed him the letter, the logbook, the photos she'd taken of the paintings. He didn't interrupt once, but his silence wasn't awe. It was calculation. When he finally spoke, it was with the caution of someone trying to find the least dangerous truth. "If this is what you say it is, Riley, if it's all real, then technically it still belongs to the countries it was taken from, or the families. It's not yours, and it sure as hell isn't something you can sell." "I don't want to sell it," she said quickly. "That's not why I know." He softened. "But you need to understand, this isn't just history. It's international law. It's federal. The wrong person finds out, and they'll treat you like you trafficked it yourself." She sat down on the porch steps, head in her hands. "So what do I do? Hide it again? Wait another 50 years? No." He sat beside her, his voice quieter now. "You do what your grandfather wanted. You protect it. You make sure the right hands get it back." She looked up at him. "How do I know who the right hands are?" He didn't answer, but the truth was already circling her like smoke. Later that week, she met with the curator from Charlotte, a woman in her 60s, who had tears in her eyes by the time she examined the 3rd crate. The brushwork, she said, was unmistakable. A lost Czech master. Another piece likely from an aristocratic Polish estate. Together, they were worth more than $6 million, but no one had claimed them in 78 years. No governments had filed recovery motions. No lawsuits. No living heirs known. The paintings weren't just valuable, they were ghosts, and Riley, somehow, had become their keeper. The first name came from one of the letters. Buried in looping script on the 2nd page of a handwritten note was a line Riley had missed on her first read. "For die, Familie Schenkel, when Gott es erlaubt." For the Schenkel family, if God allows. She stared at it for a long time. A name, a direction, maybe even a final wish. She typed it into every archive and search engine she could find, cross-referenced art restitution databases, museum indexes, genealogy forums. Most paths led nowhere until she hit a post on a European history board from someone named M. Schenkel, asking about wartime losses and a missing portrait, believed taken from a Krakow estate in 1944. Riley's hands trembled as she typed her reply. It took 2 days for a response. And when it came, it was cautious, polite, but skeptical. The writer claimed to be a granddaughter, now living in Geneva. Her grandmother had spoken of a portrait once of her own mother, painted before the war, but no one believed it had survived. Most of the family had assumed it was destroyed in a firebombing. The girl in the painting, she said, wore a red scarf. Riley attached the photo of the portrait, the one she'd first uncovered, the one whose eyes had haunted her from the barn floor. The reply came in less than 20 minutes. Just 5 words. "Oh my God. That's her." Oh. The next week blurred. Lawyers got involved. Jonah oversaw the calls. A neutral international foundation offered to broker the return. Riley insisted on one condition. It had to be hand-delivered, not by a courier, not by a customs agent. By her. She flew to Switzerland on a rainy Thursday, with the painting packed in a sealed crate, her hands white-knuckled around the paperwork. Customs flagged her, twice. But with documentation in order, and the blessing of an art recovery non-profit, she was allowed through. The reunion took place in a quiet gallery space arranged by the foundation. The Schenkel family arrived together 3 generations, unsure of what to expect. Riley stood quietly by the crate as the curator unlatched it and pulled back the cloth. No one spoke for a full minute. Then the eldest woman in the room, gray-haired, silent until now, stepped forward and ran her hand gently along the bottom of the frame. She whispered something in Polish, eyes wet. "She used to sing to me," she said in English, voice trembling, "before the soldiers came." Riley swallowed hard. The $6 million hadn't mattered in that moment. Not the risk, not the legal knots she'd have to untangle, not the plane in her barn, or the paintings still in crates. What mattered was this: something stolen had been returned. A promise her grandfather couldn't keep had been carried out. And the silence that had hung over this story for nearly a century had finally broken. Not with fanfare, but with grace. When she got back to North Carolina, the plane didn't look any different. Still massive, still weathered, still tucked beneath the slanted roof of the barn like a secret wrapped in steel. But Riley was different. And somehow, the way she looked at the aircraft changed, too, not like a mystery, not anymore, like a mirror. Something old and quiet, finally seen for what it was. The press found out a few weeks later. She hadn't told anyone. But word travels fast through art circles, and faster still through small towns. First, it was a journalist from the Charlotte Observer, then a producer from a morning show, then phone calls from New York and Berlin, and even the Smithsonian, all wanting interviews, photos, features. One even asked if she'd be open to selling the plane. She ignored most of them, not because she wasn't tempted. $6 million in art recovery, an untouched military aircraft, a personal story that sounded like fiction. It all had the makings of a documentary, or a book deal, or a check with a lot of zeros. But Riley had spent the last few weeks on European trains and in art foundations and quiet hotel rooms, thinking about something else entirely. What good is a legacy if you don't do anything with it? The rest of the crate still sat in the cargo hold, untouched since she returned. Jonah had filed paperwork with a federal agency that partnered with international restitution services, ensuring the returns would be legal and documented. One by one, the items would be returned to museums, estates, and families, some still living, others long gone but represented through archives and art historians who'd been searching for decades. But Riley didn't just want to hand them off. She wanted to honor them. She started small, cleaned out the hayloft above the barn, and turned it into a makeshift workspace, borrowed scaffolding from the local fire department, rewired the floodlights, polished the wings of the C-82 with rags, cleaner, and grit. Then she took a piece of plywood, screwed it to the inside wall, and tacked the letter from her grandfather to the center. Around it she began to pin things. Old photos, copies of the logs, snapshots of each painting, and a handwritten note she wrote one evening after too much coffee and not enough sleep. Not everything lost is meant to stay hidden. Some things wait for the right hands to find them again. She called the project Skykeeper, not a museum. Not exactly. More like a sanctuary, a restoration space, a story in progress. People began stopping by, veterans, local teachers, young mechanics who'd heard about the girl with the plane. She let them in, told them the truth, let them walk beneath the wings and feel what it was like to stand inside history that had been hidden for too long. The money never came up, but something else did. Purpose. Fall arrived quietly, slipping golden light through the trees and laying it across the barn floor like an invitation. Riley had been working alone that morning. Just her, a sanding block, and the edge of the port side wing that caught the rising Sunday. She moved slow, not from fatigue, but from something closer to reverence. This wasn't about restoration anymore. Not really. It was about listening, letting the old plane speak. She'd spent the last few weeks cataloging every remaining crate in the hold, cross-referencing names, reaching out to embassies, historians, even archivists who specialized in lost wartime records. Each item had a destination now, or at least a path toward one. And in the process, Riley had become something she never expected. Not a collector, not a curator, a bridge between past and present, between grief and grace, between what had been taken and what could still be returned. That morning, she found one last compartment, hidden beneath the cockpit floor, accessible only by unscrewing a warped panel held in place with rusted Phillips heads. It wasn't much a shallow cavity, lined with felt, nearly empty, except for one thing, a small leather-bound notebook. Inside, in that same familiar handwriting, was a single page, her grandfather's. Riley, I never wanted to keep these things, but I couldn't let them be lost again. I couldn't trust the world to care. I hope you'll know what to do. I hope you'll do it better than I did. If you're holding this, it means you already have. She sat there for a long time, the notebook resting in her lap, the smell of oil and cedar and thyme heavy in the air. The letter wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It said everything he'd never been able to say in person, that he'd trusted her, that this wasn't just a task. It was an inheritance of spirit. Outside, the trees were beginning to turn, reds, golds, the color of memory. She walked out of the plane barefoot, stepping into the morning light, letting the cool ground center her. The barn looked the same as always, crooked roof, aging beams, wide doors half open, but to her, it was sacred now. A cathedral of quiet stories, a place where history hadn't ended, just waited. Later that week, she framed the letter and hung it beside the others, not because it was valuable, because it was the final piece of the story. Some people came to see the plane out of curiosity. Some came to see the art, but most stayed for the story. The girl who didn't sell, who didn't hide, who built something instead. And when they asked her why she didn't take the money, Riley would always smile. My grandfather didn't bring it home for that, she'd say. He brought it home for someone to finish what he couldn't, and now she had.